After 2 decades of trying and failing to open a hospital in Princeton, the task was finally done. But the challenges it would face were far from over. The 1920s and 30s were a time of transition for healthcare, Perry Memorial Hospital, and for Bureau County as a whole. Cars and electricity were becoming commonplace. Since the Cherry Mine disaster, all of the area mines had closed and population growth had come to a halt.
After the mines began to close after the Cherry Mine disaster in 1909, and we see the county's population begin to decrease by a few thousand people every year, and initially it was the exodus of all the miners and mining families from the eastern part of the county.
Without new migrants settling in Bureau County, the future of the area would depend on childbirth. Before Perry Memorial Hospital opened, home births were essentially the only option. Now women could go to a safe, sterile environment with staff who had experience handling complications. In addition to childbirth, the hospital had a burgeoning reputation for surgical operations and treatments.
They weren't that far from having blood transfusions at that point, which was a new invention, and penicillin coming on the market as well in the early 20th century were major technological advances in healthcare that bolstered people's confidence in doctors and hospitals at large.
In time, patients started arriving from all over the country. By the end of its first decade, Perry Memorial Hospital had become so consistently crowded that nurses had to hang cots at the end of the corridors to accommodate the overflow. It was at that point that the hospital directors made the decision to expand the hospital. On July 17, 1931, a new east wing of the hospital was completed for $45,000. The top floor of the new wing was devoted entirely to a maternity unit, which had bassinets for 12 babies. In all, the addition meant Perry Memorial Hospital could now comfortably care for 41 people. But relief from the expansion was short-lived. Patients again had to be placed on cots in the hallways, and services were starting to outgrow the facilities.
I was born there in 1934. I'm telling my age. It was exactly 2 months after my husband was born there. Most of my classmates were born at the hospital. So it would have been ahead of that the babies were born at home.
Automobiles bringing people their freedom to come and go for all sorts of reasons, for shopping on Saturday nights and, of course, for coming to town for medical treatment. That gave people their choice in doctors. So when you didn't have access to transportation, you got whatever doctor was going to come to your house. But if you had access to transportation, then you had the choice to be able to go be seen at different offices in different towns by somebody that you may prefer as a doctor. And I think that led to us having more county people coming in that would have normally stayed home and received their medical treatment at home on the farm or in whatever small town setting that they lived in.
In 1937, the country was in the middle of the Great Depression, but spending programs from the federal government made it possible for progress to continue. The city of Princeton started applying for grants to expand the hospital, and in 1938, an application was approved. The federal government sent $23,000 for the construction project. A municipal bond was combined with individual donations, allowing more than $50,000 for the new wing and equipment.
Surgery was on the top floor on the west wing. You always looked to see if the light was on, if so, somebody was having surgery.
Even with the added space, the overcrowding would peak over the next 2 decades. World War I had propelled medical knowledge forward by leaps and bounds, and now World War II was doing the same.
During World War II, the U.S. Armies and Navy started training hundreds and hundreds of nurses. And so all of a sudden, the nursing profession was being modernized by the war effort. The professional workforce that was available for Perry would have grown substantially at that point. So after World War II, advances in vaccinations and immunizations allowed for less chronic diseases that were traveling and circulating. So I think people were coming in for maybe more elective care, as it were, or things that weren't so life-threatening.
Hospitals had to be ready to care for a wider range of diseases and conditions, which required more staff with specialized training and newer equipment. Insurance was starting to become a major factor in healthcare, and by the end of the Second World War, the Depression was over and many people were wealthier than they had ever been before. All in all, it meant more people could afford treatments and more treatments had to be readily available. Throughout the 1940s, management and control of Perry Memorial Hospital steadily declined. A nursing superintendent had been in charge of day-to-day operations since 1920, and those operations were becoming too challenging to handle alone.
The doctors had their own practices and their own private businesses, and they were just using space in the hospital when they needed it for their patients. So a doctor's private practice didn't have any vested interest in the hospital. It was just there when they needed it.
The issue came to head in 1947 during Princeton's election for mayor. Candidate Samuel Traynor built his platform around reorganizing the leadership of Perry Memorial Hospital. Traynor lost the election, but his message was not lost. That year, the hospital hemorrhaged more than $70,000 out of a budget of less than $200,000. The huge loss was enough to get the attention of the new mayor, Dr. Carl Nelson. Dr. Nelson had worked at Perry Memorial Hospital since 1927 and agreed with Traynor that a new leadership structure was needed.
The hospital was going broke. There was a real insurrection with the employees. The reputation of the place was terrible. And they the city council just sort of threw their hands up and said, we've got to get a whole new board and start again.
On June 16, 1947, the Princeton City Council approved the first board of directors, consisting of Watson Lawton, Robert Disarray, and Celia Diller. Mr. Lawton was elected as the president of the board. He would serve in that capacity for the next 23 years. The search soon began for a hospital administrator. The board found a man named Norman Roberts from Massachusetts. Mr. Roberts had many years of experience in hospital management. Mr. Roberts resigned after 6 months, stating he was not given full support of the board. By this point, Perry Memorial Hospital's reputation was low and sinking lower. Now more than ever, someone was needed to turn things around. The hospital board resumed the search again, this time looking locally. They found 2 men from the Piper Manufacturing Company in Princeton. The first, Duncan Bryant, was hired as a full-time auditor. The other, Arnold Walter, had the leadership qualities needed to bring about change and growth.
They had not done well financially. I think they were real focused on money and accounting, and budgeting, and all those kinds of things. And they probably liked the idea that he was a local and had worked at the local banks some. But they were looking for a business type person.
He jumped at the opportunity, and together Walter and Bryant faced the almost impossible task of turning the hospital around.
My dad's office was on one side of the front entrance and Duncan's was on the other. That was probably the time when they at least started thinking about bringing this hospital into the 20th century if it was going to succeed, because I think it wasn't there when he started.
Mr. Walter set to work. One of his main goals was to improve the quality of services and earn approval from well-renowned organizations like the American College of Surgeons. He hired specialized physicians for the laboratory and X-ray departments. He created new policies and expectations for nurses and doctors and began to streamline the services. By the end of 1948, Perry Memorial Hospital was back in the black. At the same time, the board started looking for new ways to engage the community, prompted by the initiative of Board Secretary Celia Diller.
She was very conscientious. She was very strong in her beliefs. And we used to call her the General. So that's the personality that she was.
Mrs. Diller was interested in starting a women's auxiliary specifically dedicated to the hospital. The auxiliary officially formed on July 19, 1948, and elected Mrs. Abby Jean Gunning as president. 66 women joined at the first meeting. In the years that followed, the auxiliary continued to grow in membership and found new ways to support the hospital.
A lot of moms didn't work then, so there was a whole social network and social organizations there, like the auxiliary.
Mr. Walter worked closely with Mrs. Gunning to find ways to keep staff and patient morale high.
Dear friend Arnold, your personal word of appreciation gave me great happiness. I so appreciated your cooperation and interest in the endeavors of the Women's Auxiliary. My dreams and wishes are being fulfilled. Most sincerely, Abby Jean Gunning.
The start of the auxiliary came at a perfect time to support the needs of the hospital. But the most needed changes went far beyond what the auxiliary could accomplish. Throughout 1950, Perry Memorial Hospital was nearly fully occupied, and at times completely full. Admissions had more than doubled since 1930. More than 400 babies were being born each year, on top of all the illnesses and injuries being treated. Mr. Walter and the board made a plan to pursue a new addition, the largest construction and renovation to date, costing an estimated $350,000. Hospital staff were instructed on how to solicit from the community, and brochures showing the overcrowding were dispersed to area residents. After the staff and supporters were trained for fundraising in the high school gymnasium, small fund drives were set up across the town. The money started to roll in, but the costs of labor and materials were beginning to skyrocket across the country. All in all, the drive raised nearly $300,000, but the estimated cost of the project had risen to nearly $600,000. By 1952, the board knew the addition was impossible, but the overcrowding could not continue either. More and more people had to wait for care or were turned away altogether. The reputation of the hospital continued to drop, and along with it, the hopes of receiving any more donations. Hope came in another form. New legislation from Illinois had made it possible for areas to set up hospital districts, much like school districts. As a district, the hospital could levy taxes on a broader area to fund major projects. There had always been some tension between the residents of Princeton and the rest of Bureau County in regards to the hospital. Leading to its opening in 1920, there had been discussion as to whether residents from outside of Princeton would be charged higher rates or whether they would even be admitted to the hospital at all. The tensions grew even more in 1952. The proposed hospital district meant taxing people throughout the county who might not ever use Perry Memorial Hospital services. Some people wanted residents outside of Princeton to pay higher rates, while others thought Princeton should shoulder more of the burden.
It was always considered Princeton Hospital, and yet people came from all around the county.
The hospital leadership received criticism from across the community. Critics claimed the board was unprepared and acting quickly and irrationally. Board President Watson Lawton fired back at the critics.
Perry Memorial Hospital is not in trouble. The hospital is at present 3 times as large as it would need to be for the residents of Princeton alone, It is either a question of eventually restricting the hospital to only the taxpayers of Princeton or increasing the facility so those outside Princeton can use it.
In a public referendum during the fall of 1952, the hospital district was thoroughly rejected. Without other options, they decided to use the money to renovate as much as possible. Construction finished in 1954. There was a small addition to the east wing, and spaces were reorganized to accommodate 16 more patients. The auxiliary gift shop, which had started a year earlier in Mr. Walter's office, received a new space just inside the main entrance. Despite the extra beds, overcrowding continued to be the biggest issue facing the hospital. At one point in 1956, Mr. Walter reported that there were 12 people on the waiting list for admission. 19 patients had been told to go elsewhere for care, and in one day, 3 surgeries were canceled because there were no beds available. Seasonal illnesses did not help the occupancy, especially during the winter months.
Our oldest boy was born in 56 and needed to have his tonsils and adenoids out. And you didn't do it in August. That was considered dog days, polio season. And so they always like to do any of that elective surgery some other time.
In the 1950s, fear of polio had gripped the nation. For thousands of years, poor sanitation meant people were generally exposed to polio frequently and at an early age. As a result, people tended to develop immunity to the virus. As the cleanliness of water and food improved during the early 1900s, the population's natural immunity went away. Polio quickly shifted from an uncommon disease to a global pandemic. By 1952, the number of cases of polio in the United States had reached an all-time high. More than 20,000 people either died or were left with paralysis. Most commonly, it attacked the muscles in the legs. Other times, polio would attack the diaphragm. In a matter of days or hours, a person could suffocate to death. During the 1940s and 50s, the iron lung became an effective way to keep people alive when polio attacked their lungs. Hospitals across the country started buying any iron lungs they could and designated specific areas for polio patients. In 1953, this practice led to the first intensive care unit. More hospitals followed suit over the course of the next decade. In 1952, at the peak of the polio epidemic, the Princeton JCs constructed and donated an iron lung to the Princeton Hospital. Fortunately, the need for the iron lung would be short-lived. In 1955, Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio, and fear of the disease would soon diminish. In December of that same year, on any given day, every bed at Perry Memorial Hospital was usually filled.
People stayed forever. It was called the Sun Porch, but they put patients out there. And I remember patients staying in there for years. It was sort of like a nursing home.
You did go to the hospital instead of a nursing home?
You put people in the hospital rather than having them out on the farm with somebody trying to take care of them, and you driving out there to see them a couple times a week.
In 1957, the hospital once again asked for support to erect a new wing. In addition to support from the city of Princeton, the fund drive managed to raise $300,000 for the construction of the new building. The first step was the demolition of the original Princeton Hospital House. In its place, the 44-bed wing known as the 60s building was completed in 1959, just as new regulations were making the other 3 wings unsuitable for care. After a decade of fighting for new space, the struggle was far from over. At the same time, Mr. Walter had another challenge to handle: the quality of care. The newly formed Joint Commission was the gold standard for hospital accreditation, and he knew that was an important step in fixing the reputation of Perry Memorial Hospital. Bit by bit, Mr. Walter prepared the hospital for quality reviews and the next steps of the process. The laboratory, under the direction of a new pathologist, received approval from the state of Illinois. The approval meant the lab could offer a wider range of tests such as the Friedman pregnancy test. A few years later, the laboratory would switch to using African claw frogs, which gave results within a few hours. Mr. Walter also realized that for accreditation to happen, the physicians would have to meet certain standards. From time to time, tension would rise when doctors' private practice policies went out of the scope of hospital standards. Other occasional spouts between medical staff and hospital leadership created tension with the public and with the Princeton City Council. One evening, 300 people stormed into City Hall during a council meeting to show support for their doctor. Perry Memorial Hospital's local reputation was at an all-time low. Despite pressures from outside, the hospital board and Arnold Walter held firm to the decisions they were making, knowing they were the right changes. Mr. Walter kept pushing ahead, slowly putting the hospital on the path to success.
I think he saw his job, because the hospital was in such a state of ill repute, to be a lot of public relations. He would deliver the mail. The mail would come to the front office and they'd sort it, and he would deliver the mail to every patient every day.
To his great relief, accreditation from the Joint Commission finally came through in 1957.
I remember that being a big accomplishment, a thing that he really worried about, were they going to pass or not, especially since it was an initial accreditation. I think everybody in every department got interviewed. Not everybody, but all the department heads and so forth. And he couldn't do much, of course, about what they said, but I'm sure he tried to prep them as best he could for what was going to be required.
Nevertheless, the need for a new building was still an issue. New safety regulations and Medicare requirements were making the original hospital wings unusable. The leadership knew the original Perry Memorial Hospital buildings would soon be condemned for failing to meet the new fire codes, and the 60s building was far too small to continue care. In the mid-1960s, the hospital board and Mr. Walter once again decided to pursue a new wing to replace the original hospital. Fortunately, this time, Perry Memorial Hospital had a much better reputation. Between donations from the community, loans, and deals with the city of Princeton, the hospital finally had the funds to begin construction. However, like many times before, soaring costs made the new building more than $1 million more expensive than originally planned. Mr. Walter ordered the construction to start anyway while he figured out a solution.
I think they gave him a hard hat and probably couldn't keep him out of the construction site. He loved those so much.
The architects devised a plan to reduce the size of the building and instead construct the frame of a third floor. The third floor would be left unfinished and unusable until a later date when funds became available. In 1969, the new Perry Memorial Hospital opened, more than double the capacity and allowing room for more than 100 patients. The hospital was finally on the right track. Finances were consistent and positive, more than enough space was available, and the reputation had improved by leaps and bounds. After 23 years of hard work, the leadership had done its job.
Perry Memorial Hospital is a monument to our community spirit and community service. The progress of our hospital thus far is but part of a further long-range plan, yet it stands as a tribute to the public spirit of our people and assurance of further advances which will keep pace with our growing community. The long overdue changes have again made secure Perry Memorial's place as one of the finest hospitals of its size in the country.
Mr. Walter retired in 1969, only a few months after the new building was completed.
I think they thought well of him. I know his employees did. He thought his employees were the most wonderful people in the world, and he knew every one of them. The maintenance guys and the kitchen people. He knew everybody and kind of treated everybody the same. And so I think people loved him for that.
The following year, Watson Lawton stepped down as president of the board.
He was a leader that pulled them through. You could see in the board minutes the things he said, the things he did that just drove things. And there's no doubt in my mind the hospital today is there because of Watson.
With new leadership coming into play, the new struggle, would be carrying the momentum forward. The next leaders would need to be ready to take what had been accomplished and run with it.